particulars come in before that. So just to let everyone else know, we are recording this video so that we can post it to the project website. But welcome to Technical Advisory Committee meeting number 3. Thank you for some time this afternoon. I know it's a busy time of year, and this meeting had kind of gotten pushed out while we were working out some things with the FAA, but I appreciate your time this afternoon. So again, I'm Leah Whitfield. I am the project manager from the Aviation Planning Group. And today I have with me Darren Murata, our lead aviation engineer from our subconsultant Dowell, and then also environmental planner Renee Dowlin from APG as well. I think you all have mostly likely met before. So just a couple key reminders. We're going to keep everybody muted during the presentation. If you have a comment or a question, you can either use the raise your hand button under participants, or sometimes it's under reactions, depending on your version of Zoom. And then you can also type a comment in the chat box as well, if you would like. We are going to have an opportunity for some discussion, but what we would like to do is get through all 3 of our alternatives, and then we'll kind of open it up for a discussion. And if anybody has any questions on the alternatives, but we felt it would be best to go through all 3. That way you don't have a question on alternative 1 that then we address in alternative 2 or 3. But again, feel free to put anything in the chat box. We'll be monitoring that throughout. And then, like I said, during the discussion, you can go ahead and use the raise your hand button so we're not talking over each other. So our agenda today is really to focus on our development concepts, but we want to first start by just looking at the master plan focus area. So what are we really focusing on from a land perspective, and then the goals of the airport master plan. Touch on the schedule and just where we are in that project schedule overall. Update you on our project progress for the entire study and what we've achieved over the last few months in particular. Then we're going to do a quick overview of facility requirements, just to remind you of what we were really trying to solve in our alternative concepts. And then Darren's going to jump in on alternatives review and discussion. So we're going to talk a little bit about high-level evaluation criteria, go through each of the 3 alternatives, and then kind of open it up for questions, and then a discussion on kind of evaluating those from a high-level perspective. And then we'll wrap up with any comments or questions, and then where the master plan goes from here. So from a big picture perspective, this is the airport's property. So this is the airport property map from the last airport layout plan, and any of the areas shaded in any of these colors are owned by the airport. So the overall property boundary includes all of this land. However, as you'll see on the next slide, we're really only focusing on a portion of that. And so if you look at the screen, it's outlined in red. And this is pretty much from, so at the bottom of your screen is the west side of the airport. And so that's Newmarket Street. So we're looking at Newmarket to the east. So while the area that the port owns, or the airport owns in the port, to the west of Newmarket Street is very important to the overall self-sufficiency of the airport. The airport master plan is really focused more on the airport proper, so the actual airfield and the surrounding land that supports the airport and those aviation operations. So just wanted to kind of give you that focus area of where we're talking, so that way you're not curious as to why we didn't come up with a development concept for more of that Newmarket area. So the next slide really shows the overall existing airport layout plan. This is the development plan that came out of the last airport master plan. And there's a few key colors, and I wanted to point those colors out because we tried to keep that same color scheme in our development concepts, and we'll keep that same color scheme in the new airport layout plan that will result from this project. So that way there's just some consistency when you're looking at the old study versus the new study. So you kind of have that grayish color for aviation related industrial, or ARI. And then you have kind of all the other aviation specific development, whether it's corporate aviation, general aviation, commercial aviation, et cetera, in that pinkish reddish color that Darren is highlighting there. So we tried to carry that forward. And again, this just kind of shows you the area of impact that we're really looking at for development concepts, whether it's on the airfield or immediately surrounding the airfield. So overall airport master plan goals that I just kind of wanted to reiterate. The first master plan goal, of course, is to meet aviation demand. And that's the demand established by the aviation forecast that was formally approved by the FAA earlier this year, but also any demand that might be in the future that's not necessarily in that forecast. When we do an aviation forecast, there are certain guidelines we have to follow that the FAA prescribes. And so we can't always have this very elaborate forecast. And we do know that there's a lot of pent-up demand in the region that isn't necessarily accounted for in that aviation forecast. So we just want to be mindful of that when we're looking at alternatives, that we want to meet that overall aviation demand, both now, 5 years, 10 years, 20, 40 years down the road. Of course, we need to meet FAA design standards. That's critical in order for the airport to receive federal funding for the airport, is we have to meet those FAA design standards. So that doesn't mean we need to go out and rebuild a taxiway right now if the fillets or the angle of the taxiway does not meet the FAA design standard as it stands right now. Design standards are constantly evolving. The FAA changes them and over time. And so that taxiway might have been built to a different FAA design standard. But that's one of the reasons we do master plans, is just to evaluate the current standards against what exists at the airport infrastructure-wise. So we just want to make that plan so that way the next time that taxiway needs to get rehabilitated, we incorporate that new design standard, whether it's for fillets or the angle of the taxiway or pavement strength. We also want to prepare Olympia for future development. So this is really important because, one, like we mentioned, that new market area really supports the self-sufficiency of the airport, but just general development at the airport. So if the airport leases land to a hangar developer, then the airport is getting that revenue from that land lease, so that way they can continue to support the operation and the maintenance and the capital investment in the airport. So we're going to make sure we're preparing Olympia for that. But also, there is other things that we can do. And so as a part of the airport layout plan, which is that map set that we're going to come out of the master plan with that will be formally approved from the FAA, one of the sheets we're going to add in is a sheet that really looks at FAA authority. So the FAA has something called Section 163, and it's relatively newly kind of spelled out in some language from the FAA. And what they've asked us to do, and this is kind of a first of its kind across the country, but they want us to do a sheet that really says FAA has authority over this parcel of land, FAA has authority over this piece, but not this piece. And so that really means if a developer came and said, I want to develop this piece of land, Rudy and the port can reference this document and say, okay, well, we don't think the FAA has authority over this, so that can be a little more streamlined of a process and not go through the NEPA process. And so we're going to be preparing that Section 163, and then we're going to take that one step even a little further, working with Rudy and the port and the FAA to submit additional documentation to the FAA to really go ahead and start that actual formal Section 163 process. So that way the airport can be ready for development when needed. So preparing Olympia for emerging aviation technologies, as you know, aviation evolves over time. And right now it's evolving very quickly. So even in the past 6 months or the past 3 or 4 months since we last met, electric aviation is continuing to evolve, hydrogen aviation, sustainable aviation fuels, if you're following any aviation news source. That's really emerging, and it's emerging quickly, but of course the timeline's also constantly changing. So we want to make sure any development we do is really taking into account that emerging aviation technologies and making sure that Olympia is at the ready to take advantage of those and be able to support their tenants in those emerging technologies. And then again, back to that self-sufficiency, that's one of those core things that the FAA requires, is that the airport needs to strive for self-sufficiency. And the port has done a great job for that, but we want to make sure that whatever we do continues to support that mission of the airport being self-sufficient. So looking at our overall airport master plan update schedule, so we started the project in March with our investigations phase. We got through that investigation phase in July, and then we moved into solutions. And so in the solutions phase, we're really looking at those draft alternatives. We're going to conduct our alternative evaluation, do our more thorough environmental review, and then come out with a recommended alternative to then put into the implementation part of the study. So there we are in the red flag. So we're in December. We've shifted things just a little bit, but we're having our 3rd technical advisory committee meeting. We would expect sometime early next year to do another public open house, and then our 4th technical advisory committee meeting as well. So still aiming for a summer completion date overall for the study. We're not trying to rush it. We're making sure we are coordinating with the Habitat Conservation Plan study and making sure everything's in alignment and consistent with that study as well. And I think their overall schedule right now is kind of final sometime late fall or early winter next year. So kind of reiterating our project update, similar to the schedule, we've completed the inventory chapter. The port has that for review, and we hope to very soon have that published as a draft for your review and the public's review. The aviation forecast chapter was approved by the FAA earlier this fall, and that chapter is available on the master plan update webpage if you'd like to take a look at that. And then the port also has a copy of the facility requirements table or chapter rather. And we are continuing to really elaborate on the electric aviation piece, especially since things are just changing so rapidly. But outside of that, that's a pretty solid draft chapter. And as soon as the port has completed their review, we'll post that draft as well for the public and for the tax review. So really right now, our current focus has been coordination with the Habitat Conservation Plan team and making sure we're in alignment with that project. And then looking at the alternatives themselves and then getting started on the airport layout plan, in particular on that property map and section 163 piece that I mentioned earlier. And then next step, future focus is really going to be after the first of the year, early next year, we'll start looking at the implementation. And then we will also eventually start that Part 139 commercial service feasibility study as well. That's going to be an appendix to the overall master plan update. So for facility requirements, this is a pretty high level list of bullet points, but just things that I wanted you to keep in mind as you look at the alternative development concepts. We want to meet the based aircraft demand as well as the transient aircraft demand of both now and in the future. So meeting that aviation forecast. We want to correct taxiway design standards to meet the existing FAA standard. So that might mean, again, the angles that I mentioned before, where the taxiways are located from the runway or how they're approaching the runway. And then we want to maintain a crosswind runway for smaller aircraft. We know that the existing crosswind runway is not necessarily needed from an FAA's perspective. And so we want to be able to maintain that if at all possible for those smaller aircraft that are utilizing it today. Looking at a terminal building, that's something that was in the plan previously, and something whether it's a general aviation or a future passenger commercial service terminal building, we just want to make sure that we've appropriately incorporated that into our development concepts. And then an airport maintenance building as well, so for storage of airport equipment, both now and in the future, expanding the fuel storage, in particular to add in sustainable aviation fuel when that demand increases. And we have room to do that. So that's kind of an easy fix around the existing fuel storage area. And then again, integrating of those emerging trends, whether it's electric aircraft or that sustainable aviation fuel. So moving into alternatives. So the alternatives really have several focus areas. So the runway system itself, the taxiways, so how you're taxiing from the apron out to the runways. And there's a lot of taxiways, so that one's a big piece. And then development areas, so looking at aviation related industrial development, and then that general aviation and looking whether it be more commercial operators that such as like an aircraft maintenance facility that needs both public access on the land side and then airside access, but then also just hangars, whether they're box hangars or they're smaller T hangars. And then biofuels, so the sustainable aviation fuels, and then the electric aviation. So this is a table that's just really for a high level discussion looking at evaluation criteria. We're not quite to the point in the master plan where we are have our set evaluation criteria, but this is really just to kind of spark a conversation with you all as the TAC today. And so we have 3 alternatives that Darren will review. And then we kind of have 5 general categories going across the table that look at how we can evaluate things. So either kind of with a 1+ sign, a 2+ sign, or a 3+ sign. So from greater impacts to lesser impacts, and then strongly meets to mostly meets. And so this table's blank right now, but just wanted to touch on each of those evaluation criteria. So satisfies facility requirements. So does it meet FAA design standards? And then how well does it meet the overall aviation demand, both now and in the future? So whether that's the demand from the forecast or demand that's really unknown at this point. Available developable land. So how well does the alternative really set the airport up for success in making sure we're maximizing that developable land? And is it preventing any future constraints? Because we want to make sure whatever we do in development that it's well thought out. That's the purpose of the master plan, and that we're not really constraining ourselves in the future if demand increases or additional land is needed. And then operational and airspace impacts. So this might be things like taxi time. Is the taxiway alternative really making it easier to taxi from point A to point B? Are we having a disruption in operations because of something in the development alternative? And then any impacts to approach procedures, runway lengths, things like that. Then environmental considerations. This is a pretty big category, and so it is tricky to really incorporate all of them in one. But again, this is just a broad level discussion purely for the purposes of this meeting. But that could include things such as noise, the socioeconomic impact, air quality, and then that consistency with the habitat conservation plan. And then roadways. So we know anything we do from a development perspective, we need to consider the impacts to the community, especially in a roadway capacity. So are we putting traffic in a different location? Are we moving too much traffic in a location? Any sort of neighboring land use that road might impact as well. So again, high level discussion criteria. We're going to come back to this table after we go through all of the alternatives, but I'll turn it over to Darren to get into the fun stuff.
Thanks, Leah. So I'm going to be talking about 3 alternatives for development. And in general, what we're going to show is increasing amounts of reconfiguration or optimization to your taxiway system. We're also going to show an alternate that revises the runway length of the crosswind runway, and we'll also show the different areas of developable area that we have with each option. So I'll just give you a quick overview of what we're looking at here. So in this dark blue color here, this represents portions of your taxiway system that are existing and proposed to remain. These red pieces here represent potential new paved areas that represent part of your taxiway system. And then these areas that are crosshatched here, these represent existing pavement that is proposed to be removed. Now this thin red line here, this represents a building restriction line. And as you can see, that's actually kind of constraining some of your development areas. And that building restriction line is primarily based on airspace requirements. And then these 2 lightly shaded areas, again, are consistent with your previous airport layout plan. So you have this bluish color that represents aviation-related industrial, and then this pinkish color that's used to represent various types of aviation development, such as small general aviation corporate, and then also areas for commercial air service here, as well as just general commercial. The other color you'll see is the yellow, which represents your runway protection zones. So let's see, I guess I'll start with alternative 1. And with alternative 1, you can see in red here, these are areas where we're realigning angled intersections, and that's primarily to meet FAA requirements. So one of the FAA requirements is for these connector taxiways to intersect the runway at right angles. So with this option, we're correcting those. We also do show removal of this section of taxiway C here. And then this portion of taxiway F, which is currently out here, we show that this would be relocated here to the minimum distance from runway 1735. And that meets the minimum FAA requirement for separation. And what that does is it opens up some additional area here for developable area. So with this option, you'll see a lot of blue. So really a lot of just using the existing taxiway system that you have now. And then the red here representing some corrections as needed to meet FAA design standards. So the next slide just shows a summary of the developable area. So all these areas here, from the industrial to the GA small development, the GA corporate over on this side, and then here we have commercial air service right here in this area. With this alternative, that amounts to just over 380 acres. And one thing you'll notice for this discussion, we've just highlighted these areas as potential development areas for the most part, rather than showing actual layouts of hangars and roads. And that's something that we'll get into with the preferred alternative. But likely for your approved airport layout plan, we may want to keep those as just general hatches, and that way you've got flexibility in the future for how you want to develop within each of those areas. So that's alternative one. Now alternative two, I'm going to switch to, and you'll see the difference in the taxiway system. So you can see a lot of changes here, a lot more new taxiway pavement. And I'll go to the next slide, and that kind of walks you through each of the changes. So similar to alternative one, we're realigning these angled intersections to intersect the runway at 90 degrees. We also show the removal of taxiway C and D. Now the big change here with this alternative, we actually show shortening runway 826. And so that does a couple things. It eliminates this hot spot right here where you do currently have the two runways crossing each other. It does continue to serve the current aircraft that are using that runway, but the biggest advantage is it actually opens up all this area here for additional development. So we show actually more potential area there for a potential commercial air service expansion. So the other changes that you'll see to the taxiway system here, this is taxiway W, and currently it's actually all the way out here. This pushes it in, brings it closer to the runway, to the minimum separation distance, and that opens up a lot more development area here. Similarly, the parallel taxiway for runway 826, this one goes into the minimum separation distance, and this provides additional development area here. So what that does in terms of your development area, you see it increase to about 445 acres of potential area, primarily in this area here, and this area here. Whereas in alternative one, that's still used up by existing taxiway pavement. So with this alternative, there's obviously a lot more construction, but you get a lot more potential area where you could use to develop it if the need arises. So next is alternative three. I'll go back and forth just one more time so you can see that. So this is alternative two, and then this is alternative three. This is pretty similar to alternative two. The difference is shown on this next slide. So this alternative adds a parallel taxiway on this side of the runway. That opens up some additional development area here. Other than that, it's very similar to alternate two, except that we keep the crosswind runway at its current length. So this doesn't include a reduction in the crosswind runway length, and you can see how that affects this area here. Other than that, most of the taxiway system is very similar to what was shown in alternate two. As far as the developable area, here at 443, it's really pretty close to alternate two, where you have a little bit less here, but you do add this area here. And the other change between this option and the previous alternates. In both alternate 1 and 2, we show commercial service here on this side and general aviation small on this side. And this option just flips the two. So we have commercial air service here on the southeast side of the airport, and then additional general aviation small here on the west side. So that's the 3 alternatives. This next slide shows just a summary. So you can see the split between the various categories is it's roughly the same. What's really the difference in alternate 2 and 3 versus 1, you just get a lot more developable area with alternative 2 and 3. And that's really a result of bringing your taxiways in to the minimum separation distance. That really just creates a lot more opportunity for developable area. And next, I am going to turn it back to Leah to talk about the differences between the 3.
Sure. Before we do that, are there any questions on any of the 3 alternatives? Is there anything that you thought should have been in the 3 alternatives that isn't in the 3 alternatives? Or any questions, just to get a better understanding of what's in 1, 2, or 3?
I have a question, Leah. This is Michelle Tierhe, Fish and Wildlife. I was curious, some of the comments that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Martha and I made when we met directly with you regarded looking at other commercial properties that are currently unoccupied and available off-site. And I was wondering, were those considerations built into any or all of these alternatives?
So these alternatives are really focusing on aviation demand, and then we are identifying some of that land, such as aviation, the land shown in gray, that could be, it could be aviation, or it could be just that aviation related as defined by the city of Tumwater. But what we're really focusing on is in the alternatives is demand for aviation businesses that have to be located on the airport. I know when we met a month or so ago, we talked about just kind of what some of those concepts would look like, say in that GA corporate area there at the bottom of the screen. And so we're not to that detail yet. So I think some of that feedback that you gave will be kind of incorporated as we move forward with some more detailed layouts once we have the preferred alternative. But for now, we're looking at really focused on the aviation demand, primarily the area shaded there in that reddish color of businesses or tenants that would have to have airside access.
Okay, so just so I'm clear, so there's still room for negotiation on any of what's pink and gray in the alternatives. And what we're actually reviewing and commenting on is basically, like you said, what is in, I guess, the off-white areas and undercolored of red and blue. But the what's in pink and what's in gray, we'll have further conversations regardless of these alternatives. Is that how I'm understanding that?
So what we'll kind of do from here is we have the 3 alternatives. We will either choose a particular alternative to move forward with the preferred alternative, or it might be perhaps kind of a combination of elements from each of the 3 that move forward into the preferred development alternative. And at that point, we'll go into a little bit more detail of looking at, okay, we say that GA corporate area at the bottom right of your screen is 49.5 acres, but it's not like that 49.5 acres, the entire acreage is going to be developed. And obviously it's only going to be developed if someone shows up and says, I need to build hangars there. But we'll really look a little bit more in detail of, taxi lanes, hangar layouts, that sort of thing at that point. So that's kind of in the next stage. I mean, I think the technical advisory committee's job is obviously to comment on things that you see, but it's purely advisory, and it's really the port's decision if they decide to pull something from one of the alternatives as we move into that preferred alternative piece. And then, as I mentioned, we'll get into that more, evaluating the different alternatives in detail and moving forward with the preferred alternative in more detail as far as evaluation criteria goes. from any of the users, is there anything that you saw kind of obvious things that might have been missed or that you were expecting to see? And Max, feel free to chime in as well. I know you're a user of the airfield.
Yeah, thanks, Leah. Nothing's coming offhand to me. No concerns.
Okay. Well, if no one else has any kind of comments or questions, we can kind of start to look at just a discussion around the 3 alternatives. And this is really just to kind of give us a feel for what you think of the 3 alternatives and the impacts or the criteria that we have set here. So that way then we can kind of take that forward as we start to look at developing a preferred alternative with the FAA and the port. So again, the 3 different alternatives are kind of down the screen on the left, and then the 5 kind of broad groups of criteria across the top. The satisfies facility requirements and available developable land. That's more in that strongly meets or mostly meets rating scale of 1 to 3. So the alternative 1, we really felt like it meets the FAA design criteria. We're correcting any design standard issues, but we're really keeping the taxiway system as kind of status quo as possible. And that's not necessarily maybe the best thing for the airport moving forward, because it's just, you know, the taxiways being efficiently used are generally, you know, more in alignment closer to the runway with that minimum taxiway runway separation. So we kind of gave that a rating of a 2, and then alternative 2 and 3, where it has more significant taxiway changes, strongly meets, just because it opens up more doors for accommodating that future aviation demand. And then available developable land, again, because alternative 2 keeps those taxiways further out, it really limits, as you saw in the table right before the slide, it limits the developable land that can support any needs and demands at the airport. But by moving those in alternative 2 and 3, we really open up a lot more availability of land, whether it gets used for businesses that are serving the airport or hangars at the airport, etc. Then operational and airspace impacts. So these 3 categories are kind of more on that less impacts, more impacts, greater impacts. Alternative 1, from an operational perspective, again, it's a little more status quo, but it's not necessarily making the airfield more efficient either. So it was just kind of remaining the same. So I think that there could be some improvements that were kind of shown in alternative 2 and 3, which is why that rating increases for 2 and 3, just because from an operational perspective, more efficient, there's really less impacts from an operational perspective in taxi delay. And then of course, from an airspace perspective, the really only big thing that's changing is in alternative 2. If we shorten that runway, again, on the positive side, as Darren mentioned, we're eliminating that hotspot, and we aren't reducing the runway length to a length that's unusable by any means, but it's meeting that design criteria for those smaller aircraft that are utilizing it. So it's actually making it a little more efficient and, of course, more cost effective in the end. We'll get into costs kind of in the next phase of the master plan. But so alternative 2 and 3, we've given it a rating of 3+ signs each. And then environmental, this one, like I said, it's really tricky because we're looking at a bunch of different things. Are we in alignment with and consistent with the Habitat Conservation Plan? Are we reducing noise, or are we increasing noise? Any socioeconomic impacts? All of those things kind of fall in this environmental category. And of course, when we look at alternative 1, things are more or less staying the same. So we're not exactly moving the noise. Airplanes are noisier when they're taxiing, and so, or on the runway system. So we're not moving that noise closer to the center of the airfield. It's kind of remaining the same, where in alternative 3, we're relocating that noise to be a little closer to the center of the action at the airport. And then looking at alternative 2 versus 3, where that potential kind of terminal facility could go if there were ever to be future commercial service. You know, looking at that from either the west side perspective or the southeast perspective of the airport. If we're putting it on the southeast side of the airport, that's of course closer to the community, closer to homes, that increases noise, impacts, that sort of thing. Same with the roadways piece there. So that's kind of where we got the rating of 1+ sign for alternative 3, because there's just a greater impact to the community by locating it there versus locating it kind of closer to the industrial area. And then roadways as well. This one's a little tricky at just kind of figuring out where traffic is flowing, and if we're changing that traffic flow. Alternative 1 doesn't really have a significant impact on roadway use, where alternative 3 would have a significant use, just because you would be coming in one area on the southeast and then out onto another road and kind of using old Highway 99 in a greater capacity than what you are. So just looking at shifting that traffic to the west side of the airport and alternative 2, that's kind of where those ratings came from. So definitely open to any comments that anyone has on the evaluation. Like I said, these are not all inclusive evaluation criteria. This is just kind of very high level for this group. We are in the process of working with Lisa and Rudy at the port at really defining what that evaluation criteria looks like in evaluating the alternatives, and we'll choose that preferred alternative and kind of go through that evaluation process in those next steps. Are there any
Leah?
questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, Jeff Powell. A couple things. First of all, I think as far as the alternative number 1, I like that better. I'm a pilot. I looked at how those taxi lanes work currently. I think you have a certain amount of knowledge on the local group of pilots that understand that. Changing it up takes a lot of disruption to do it. And I saw on alternative number 2, it looked like we had a 90 and a 90. I can tell you from my own experience, nighttime, the straighter lines we take, the better off we are as far as not having some type of accident or incident. In addition, I think the best alternative is number 1 for the purpose, if we ever do get commercial service, that stays closest to I-5. And if we're going down Center Street, we have some other options rather than bringing commercial service individual customers from the I-5 all the way down Old 99 potentially to an area that is already somewhat congested. It's not failing, but by the same token, we don't need to make it fail either.
Darren, do you want to jump back to the alternative slides while he's talking?
Yep.
Sorry, go ahead, Jeff.
So you've got your commercial service on alternative 1. We don't know how big commercial service is going to be. And so consequently, to start forecasting that you have a plethora of commercial activity, I think we're forecasting perhaps never. And we could be forecasting 5 years, 10 years down the road. We still have a mitigation with fish and wildlife before we can do anything realistically. And then the other thing that I would bring to everybody's attention is there is nothing wrong with keeping runway 8 and 2.6 at its current level. The reason I say that is I don't do a lot of crosswind landings, but I've been a pilot for 40 years. But those who are training for crosswind need that facility to train. The other option is in a high wind day, if we ever have to have an air ambulance come in, and we do have air ambulances come in, and we don't have the ability for them to land on 1-7, and that is a problem. Giving them the option of a direct landing with wind on their nose at 20 miles or 20 knots is a lot better than asking them to do a crosswind landing at 20 knots, which they may or may not be able to comply with.
Mm-hmm.
So those are my observations based on this. If I had to pick something today, I would say we can probably work a little bit on alternative 1 to solve some of the other problems. But when it comes to the runways, I would not I would not shorten up 8 and 2/6. And when it comes to the taxi lanes, I think you've got a minimal amount of work to be done. I do like what you've done as far as the runway activity. And I like how you eliminated that one runway, so you did add more GA facility property. Those are all good things, but that's right there. But those are, you want to comment, so that's my comment.
Yeah.
And
No,
I
this
think
is-
those are viable.
Yeah, this is great. So the reason, and I think we said this, the reason we looked at potentially shortening 826 is really because from the federal government's perspective, it's not eligible for federal funding. So as the port looks at just kind of the financial feasibility of keeping it, does it make more sense to shorten it somewhat to save the port money, or to at least make it feasible for the port to even continue to support it? And I think, and I do want to reiterate, overall, obviously, this is a 20-year study. So, we're planning these things. This doesn't mean they're each all these activities are going to happen in the next 5 years from a taxiway perspective or a development perspective, or the next 10 or 15 or maybe even 20. But we want to make sure that, we properly plan where those taxiways should go. So that way, when it comes up for the rehab, or when it comes up in the capital improvement plan, that we have that plan in place. So, for example, if we were to keep Whiskey where it exists today, I'd have to go back and look at the condition and how long before that pavement needs rehabilitated. Rudy, you might know. But, perhaps we keep it where it is now, but then, the ultimate goal is to move it closer in, if that commercial air service area were to be needed one day, down the road. So I think there's things, I just want to make sure everybody understands that, this is a long-term plan. There's not going to be significant changes to the airfield, overnight, or even in the next 5 years. Most likely it'll be when the taxiways need to be rehabilitated. We're not going to go dig up good pavement unless there's really a need. So, but those are great comments, Jeff.
I was just curious whether Jeff had any specific thoughts about taxiway Whiskey.
Whiskey is fine the way it is currently, and I agree with you. There will be a time that you want to pull it in. I get that idea, because that will give you some commercial facility property to use, and I would encourage that. But I don't think you need to spend that money today or plan for it in the next 5 years, when I think, and Rudy could argue with me, I think we could, as we've already done, 8 and 2/6 is 75 feet wide, not 150 anymore. So they have made a decision to maintain less of 826, which I think has merit, but to eliminate 826 to a length that a jet potentially can't land or take off on it, I think that's a problem.
That's good input. And again, just reminding the group, think 20 years, what do we ultimately want the facility to look like? And then what we'll do is, when we have that preferred alternative, then we'll start to look at, okay, how do we implement it? At what point does that taxiway rehab come up for Whiskey? And at what point do we need to relocate it, or do we keep it where it is? All of those sorts of things will happen in that implementation piece, and we'll come up with kind of phased graphics of, here's what the airfield might look like in 5 years, here's what it might look like in 10 years, and here's what it might look like at that 15+ year mark. So that's good to hear, Jeff, that you think, moving Whiskey in eventually is a good plan. It's just not necessarily a priority in the short-term plan.
Right. And the other alternative, you got 1, 2, and 3. I'm surprised we didn't have a runway extension on 1, 7, and 3, 5. If we are going to truly look at being a regional airport that can service a customer, if you will, pick a small carrier, we need to look at doing an extension of that runway. And that should have been at least one of the options.
So keep in mind that the master plan is really focused on the airport design criteria and the critical aircraft that it was established in the aviation forecast that was approved by the FAA. So these alternatives, we really didn't have the necessity to show a runway extension. We do have that separate task as an appendix to the master plan update, that we will start to look at that commercial service feasibility, and is it feasible, is it not? And we'll look at it's going to be a mini master plan. So we'll look at facility requirements, or sorry, we're going to look at an aviation forecast and determine a critical aircraft. And then we'll look at facility requirements, and we'll do development concepts again, particular for that kind of potential commercial air service of the future. So that way, if that were to ever come to fruition, the port is prepared and adequately has planned around. So we will look at that to see if that's a necessity to accommodate anything in the future, but that'll be kind of a separate task in 2022.
Okay. Those are my comments.
Thank you.
Thank
I
you.
appreciate those. Anyone
Is there-
else? Oh, go ahead, Max.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, is there any thoughts, I see Jeff's comment about the terminal, whether it be a GA terminal or a passenger terminal, and the access to, the road network, having the, looking at like alternative 3, seeing it over on that, kind of paralleling 826, rather just be curious what the thought process, moving it over. Yeah, exactly. Moving it to that GA small area, and then kind of keeping that east side of the airport GA, and then, have the terminal area on that side of things, to just keep the road access in kind of top of mind.
Mm-hmm. Definitely, and that's been one of the biggest conversations we've had over where should that reserved land go. In the last master plan, in the airport layout plan, it's right where Darren's pointer is now, is where that land was kind of set aside, and obviously where the past passengers went out of. So we looked at things like coming off of Old Highway 99 into that commercial air service area, and then coming out to the south. So kind of one way in, one way out, help eliminate some of that traffic congestion on Old Highway 99. But then we were also concerned that just that's closer to the houses and other things. But on a positive side, from a planner perspective, if I had to choose where to put it, what's the number one thing that every commercial service airport complains about is not enough space, right?
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
So there's more space on that southeast side overall. That you could accommodate. And I mean, obviously it really depends if it ever comes to fruition, how much space is really required initially, but you're less constrained in that southeast portion than you are on the west portion. So there's pros and cons, I think, to both. But I agree, just from a road perspective, being closer to I-5, I mean, the west side, and you're just less impacts to the community, I think, on that side.
Yeah, exactly. That does, you got all that residential right around there, and it's going to busy up really fast when you have people coming and going from the terminal. So, yeah, all in all, I like it. Are you able to send these out to me or anybody, I guess?
Yes, I think we can do that, and this will get posted on the website as well.
Awesome. Cool.
Yeah, and I think as planners, what we want to look at are good ideas and bad ideas. I think that's part of our job as planners, or to come up with the bad ideas too, because that helps us realize some of the good ideas. So we tried to really be inclusive and look at all possibilities from a airfield perspective, and from a just kind of reserving land, and really look, I know we didn't talk a lot about, but just kind of looking at general aviation small, and like you said, kind of keeping the east side of the airfield with that general aviation small. So continuing to build those T hangars to the south. If we were to keep commercial air service kind of reserved land where it's shown on the existing airport layout plan, and keeping that GA, again, like you said, Max, to that east side. So everything GA over there, and everything kind of bigger on the west side. But looking at this one, you see kind of general aviation corporate, so more like box hangars versus T hangars. Looking at that, anybody who would need landside access and airside access that might be serving like an avionics shop or FBO, or et cetera, any of those kind of commercial operators. But so we kind of tried to think through small general aviation and where that goes versus more of the corporate aviation that might be jet traffic. And then I don't think, Darren, I'm sure you probably touched on it, but the proposed helipad as well. So I know there's been some conversations about that where the old airport layout plan has it, it's not necessarily in a great spot. If someone lands out there, they're hiking across the field and then down into the ditch to get to the FBO. So from a helicopter operation perspective, I'd love to hear any feedback that anyone in the group has, whether it's that helipad or just kind of general impacts to helicopter operations. There might not be any, but if you think of helicopter operation impacts, that would be good to consider too. Okay. Well, kind of where we go from here, I'm gonna go to the next steps. So we're again kind of wrapping up the solutions phase of the master plan update over the next few months. So we have our draft alternatives. We're going to go into an alternative evaluation and then really start that environmental review. We have some sub-consultants on our team that we've been starting to engage. Renee has in the recent months, SWCA being the main one, looking at the criteria, making sure we're incorporating into and aligning ourselves with the habitat conservation plan. And then we'll plan on hopefully presenting to the public these alternatives in early 2022, and then scheduling a technical advisory committee meeting with you as well. We also hope to present to the Port Commission early 2022 as also. And then we'll get into that implementation, which is really where we'll start to look at how is development phased. Obviously, we're not going to take the approach of let's build it and hope that they come by any means, but we just want to make sure that the airport has that capital improvement plan, especially when it comes to pavement maintenance, and making sure that our pavement remains in good condition for the operators at the airport. And then, of course, as the habitat conservation plan wraps up later in 2022, a year from now, how that any development at the airport can, kind of take place. And we hope in that implementation plan to really take what the HCP has and incorporate that into the master plan and really come up with almost kind of like instructions or a checklist. If someone comes to the airport and wants to develop a hangar, here's the steps that you have to go through in order to do so. And then we'll also do, of course, cost estatements for all of the projects for the master plan. And then we'll look at that just financial feasibility funding. Where could the funding come from? What's eligible, what's not eligible from an FAA perspective. And then everything will get wrapped up into that airport layout plan set of maps that we have. So land use, the property plan, the terminal area plan, the overall airport layout plan, and then kind of the approaches, any obstruction analysis, that sort of thing. And then that will have to be approved formally from the FAA. And then, of course, the full draft report that would go out for public comment. I mentioned earlier that as the port finishes their review of the technical chapters, those will go up on the website. So that way it's not all at once, but we'll have a full draft report and then the final airport master plan update report at the end. So I think that's all, unless there are questions from the group. Michelle.
Yeah, thanks, Leah. Thanks for all your hard work on this and showing alternatives. I was questioning time-wise, at what stage would you like some formal comments on the alternatives from the agencies? When would those be most helpful to you? You want those now? Do you feel like you're at a place where you've really ironed out these alternatives well enough for them to be commented on? Or would you like us to wait?
I would, Darren, I'll take your opinion too, but I mean, I think just based on the feedback we've got from the group, I would say, unless we hear something from another technical advisory committee member in the next week or two, I would say, 1st of January, 1st of the year, we would be ready for any sort of comment that you might have in regarding the alternatives, before we kind of move into that next step, or as we move into that preferred alternative step.
Okay, so, and you said that
January.
Okay, 1st of January, and all of this information is going to be posted online, so we can get all the alternatives there. Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, with the end of the season, I can't promise it will be January 1st, but I can promise you by mid-January.
Sure. Yeah, no problem. Yeah, I think we'll kind of be wrapping up the but we'll be wrapping up probably our evaluation criteria, establishing of that by mid-January, and then really start to look at that evaluation. So I think that's good timing.
Great, thank you.
I'm sure everyone wants to look at an airport master plan over the holidays, so.
Isn't that how we all enjoy spending our time? Cleaning an airport? Well, thank you all again for your time. Oh, Katrina has a comment, I think.
Yeah, it really struck me in the second two options, how much an increase in commercial air service or area dedicated to that use would be. And I am curious to understand, and I'm not an expert, this is all new to me, really, but I'm interested to understand what in the FAA forecast is indicating that is what is going to be needed here.
So right now it's just kind of a broad brush of this area would make sense for that commercial air service to go. We're definitely not to the level of detail, especially on the commercial air service side, of looking and saying this is how big of a footprint we would need for potentially a passenger terminal 10 years from now, 30 years from now, 50 years from now, or how many parking spaces we would need or number of passengers. We're not quite there yet, but as we get into that appendix, we wanted to kind of get through alternatives and then jump into that piece of the overall task order that we have from the port. And so we'll establish that aviation forecast, and then that will kind of help us set the stage of, okay, how many passengers could Olympia, and there's constraints obviously of the airport. And so based on those constraints, what does that aviation forecast look like from an operations perspective, type of aircraft, and passenger levels? And so once we have that information, that facility requirements that we do under that appendix will really help us narrow down what that footprint overall looks like. So we want to kind of dive into that before we finalize any sort of preferred alternative, just to make sure we have enough room set aside. But I think for now, we're just kind of erring on the side of caution of here's the area that would make sense for that. And does that footprint kind of shrink or grow? I think that's to be determined still. Hopefully that helps.
Thank you.
Okay, Michelle, I didn't know if you still had a question or if you just hadn't raised.
No, I'm sorry, I didn't.
Okay,
Yeah, I didn't lower my hand. Sorry.
Just wanted to make sure I wasn't missing something. Okay, Zachary.
Hey, Zach Radmer, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm just sitting in for Martha today, who's out. So in that any of these alternatives have to be consistent with the Habitat Conservation Plan, and we just got a new draft of the Habitat Conservation Plan to review. We've got a workshop in sort of mid-January. We're going to be focusing on reviewing that Habitat Conservation Plan, and you probably won't see any comments on this from us until after we kind of understand the new draft that we've been sent.
Okay, that's great to know about the workshop in January. I wasn't aware of that. I know, hey, Renee, you'd have to remind me, or Rudy, when we received the most recent version. I think it was a few weeks ago, so I assume we have the most recent version as well for review. But good to know that it would be after that kind of January workshop before any comments. And again, I want to make it clear that just because we say that there's 85.5 acres available for general aviation small, it's really just identifying areas on the airport. That doesn't mean all 85 acres are ever going to be developed. It doesn't mean that between the hangars and the taxi lanes, it's going to take up all grassy area or all wooded area or whatever it might be. This is just kind of, this is the chunk of land. This is where it would make sense to put those general aviation small aircraft future hangars. And then, as the port sees the need, or as the developers see the need, then they'll be able to go in and really detail out, okay, this is what that area would look like. This is what we would need for parking. This is what we would need for square footage of hangars or taxi lanes, and how it all kind of connects together. That's kind of, the master plan is really looking at aviation demand, meeting FAA standards, and it's really done in an unconstrained manner with aviation as as that key thing. And then of course there are other steps post master plan before projects can happen if NEPA applies, that will go into more details of those impacts. You know, even when we do our environmental review and our evaluation criteria, it's still very high level, but that's that NEPA purpose to determine if NEPA is necessary and what those impacts would be and can they be mitigated or not. But for now, we're just kind of coordinating with the HCP team to make sure we have an understanding of what's required. And as I mentioned, I'm hoping at the end of the master plan, we can really kind of put together a very simple section of the implementation plan that makes it clear for both the port and the city of Tumwater and any developers in the future of here's how you go about developing at the airport. And thank you for filling in for Martha. I appreciate it. It's good to have a representative. Okay, well, unless there's any other questions, we won't keep you any longer. This presentation will get posted to the port's website. And then of course you have my contact information on the screen and you know how to reach Rudy as well. And then there's the master plan update email address, also ampupdate@portolympia.com. If you have any questions or comments, you're welcome to submit those as well. And if not, we wish you a happy holiday season, whatever that holiday might be, and a happy new year. And we hope to continue to work with you in the new year. Rudy, any last words? Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Oh.